I was 12 years old when the world was supposed to end, and I remember everything about that year with the kind of clarity that trauma brands into your memory. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 47 now, sitting in my living room in Portland, Oregon, drinking coffee and watching the rain streak down the windows like it does every other October morning. But sometimes, on days like this, I'm transported back to that little girl in rural Kansas, the one who believed with every fiber of her being that she'd never grow old enough to worry about things like mortgage payments or whether her daughter would get into a good college. I was never supposed to have a daughter. I was never supposed to have any of this ordinary, beautiful, complicated life. The prophecy came from Pastor Davies. I can still see him clearly, standing at the pulpit of the First Light congregation, his face red with conviction, his voice booming through the small church that smelled of old hymnals and furniture polish. He was a big man, not just in physical presence but in the way he commanded a room, the way people leaned forward when he spoke, hanging on every word like it was oxygen itself. He'd been our pastor for as long as I could remember, and to my 12-year-old self, he was as close to God as anyone could get without actually being divine. When Pastor Davies spoke, it was as if the heavens themselves were speaking through him. It started gradually, the way these things always do. First, there were sermons about end times, about signs and wonders, about how the world was careening toward its final days. This wasn't unusual, we'd always been taught about Revelation and the Second Coming, but there was a new urgency in his voice, a new specificity. He started talking about dates, about calculations he'd made based on scripture, about patterns he'd discovered in the Bible that pointed to one undeniable conclusion. The rapture was coming. He knew when. God had revealed it to him through prayer and study and divine inspiration. September 23, 1994. That was the date. That was when the faithful would be taken up and the tribulation would begin. I remember the first time he announced it from the pulpit. My mother gasped beside me, grabbing my father's hand so tightly her knuckles went white. Around us, the congregation erupted into a mixture of shocked murmurs and hallelujahs. Some people cried. Others looked terrified. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the church nursery, fainted right there in the third pew. Pastor Davies stood above it all, serene and certain, his arms raised like Moses before the Red Sea. My father was a believer before that day, but after the prophecy, he became something else entirely. Dad had always been a quiet man, steady as a Kansas sunrise, working his job at the grain elevator, coming home for dinner, reading his Bible before bed. But the prophecy transformed him. Suddenly, his faith had a deadline, an urgency, a purpose beyond the abstract promise of eventual salvation. He threw himself into preparation with the kind of intensity I'd only seen him apply to harvest season. He started holding prayer meetings at our house 3 times a week. Our living room would fill with people from the congregation, all of them on their knees, praying for hours until their voices went hoarse. They prayed for the salvation of the unsaved, for strength to endure what was coming, for the grace to be found worthy when Christ returned. I'd sit on the stairs in my nightgown, listening to them, feeling the fervor radiating off them like heat. My mother would be down there with them, tears streaming down her face as she prayed, her whole body shaking with the weight of her devotion. Mom started homeschooling me and my younger brother Tommy that spring. She pulled us out of public school in March, even though I'd been doing well, even though I had friends I'd miss, even though Tommy was only in 2nd grade and loved his teacher. She couldn't justify sending us to a place that taught evolution and secular humanism when we had so little time left. Every morning, we'd gather around the kitchen table, and instead of math and science, we'd study scripture. We memorized entire books of the Bible. We learned about the signs of the end times. We prepared our hearts for what was coming. I didn't question it. How could I? Everyone I knew, everyone I trusted, everyone I loved believed with absolute certainty that September 23rd would be the last day of the world as we knew it. Pastor Davies led special services every week, teaching us what to expect, how the rapture would feel, what we needed to do to ensure we weren't left behind. He said it would be like being pulled upward by an invisible force, that in the blink of an eye we'd be transformed, given new bodies, transported to meet Jesus in the air. Those who weren't ready, who hadn't truly accepted Christ, would be left to face the tribulation, 7 years of unprecedented horror and suffering. The fear of being left behind consumed me. I was 12 years old, and I became obsessed with my own salvation. Every night, I'd lie in bed and replay every sin I'd committed, every mean thought, every moment of doubt, every time I'd been impatient with Tommy or rolled my eyes at my mother. What if I wasn't really saved? What if I thought I was a Christian but God knew my heart was impure? The idea of watching my family disappear while I remained, of being left alone in a world descending into chaos, terrified me beyond words. I'd pray until I fell asleep, sometimes waking up in the middle of the night in a panic, praying all over again, asking God to forgive me, to please not leave me behind. Tommy was 9, and he handled it differently. He became quiet, withdrawn. He stopped playing with his toys. I'd find him sitting in his room, just staring out the window, and when I asked what he was thinking about, he'd say, "Nothing," in this small, hollow voice that broke my heart even then. Years later, he told me he'd been trying to imagine what it would be like to not exist, to be gone from the world. He said he couldn't picture heaven, couldn't really understand what it would mean to leave everything behind. He was 9 years old and trying to come to terms with his own mortality because a grown man in a position of authority had told him he needed to. Our whole community changed. The First Light congregation was a tight-knit group to begin with, maybe 150 people in regular attendance, most of them families who'd known each other for generations. But the prophecy turned us into something else, something insular and intense. People quit their jobs. Why work when the world was ending? The Johnsons sold their farm, their family's land for 3 generations, and donated the money to the church. Mrs. Garrett stopped her cancer treatments. What was the point of fighting cancer when the rapture was coming? She'd get her new body soon enough. Young couples got married quickly, wanting to enter heaven with the blessing of holy matrimony. The teenagers in our congregation stopped worrying about college applications. Why plan for a future that wouldn't exist? I remember my friend Jennifer, who was 16 and had dreams of becoming a veterinarian, burning all her college brochures in a barrel behind the church. She was crying as she did it, but Pastor Davies stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, telling her she was making the right choice, that earthly dreams meant nothing compared to eternal glory. Dad sold his truck, the one he'd been so proud of, the one he'd saved for years to buy. He gave the money to the church's end times ministry, funding the printing of pamphlets that warned people about what was coming, urged them to get saved while there was still time. Mom sold her mother's jewelry, pieces that had been in the family for generations. Material possessions, she said, would only weigh us down. We were supposed to be focused on the eternal, not the temporary. The atmosphere in our house that summer was strange. There was a manic quality to it, a desperate cheerfulness. We'd have family dinners where everyone smiled too wide and spoke too brightly, as if we could convince ourselves we were happy about the world ending. But underneath it all was this current of anxiety, of fear, of something that felt like grief for a loss that hadn't happened yet. We were mourning the future while trying to celebrate its approaching absence. I remember my last birthday, in July. I turned 12, and instead of the usual party with cake and presents and friends from school, it was just our family and a few people from church. They gave me a new Bible with my name embossed in gold on the cover. Mom had tears in her eyes when she handed it to me. "This is your last birthday on earth," she said, smiling through her tears. "Next year, you'll be celebrating in heaven." I thanked her and tried to feel the joy I was supposed to feel, but all I could think was that I'd never be 13, never get my driver's license, never go to prom, never have any of the things I daydreamed about. And I felt guilty for mourning those losses because I was supposed to be excited about heaven. As September approached, the intensity reached a fever pitch. Pastor Davies held services every night that month. The church was always packed, people standing along the walls when there weren't enough seats. He'd preach for hours, his voice rising and falling, building to these crescendos of passion where the entire congregation would be on their feet, hands raised, crying out to God. People spoke in tongues. Some claimed to have visions of angels. There were healings, or what people believed were healings. Old Mr. Patterson said his arthritis was gone. Sarah Chen said her migraines had disappeared. It felt like the Holy Spirit was moving among us with unprecedented power, confirming that we were right, that the prophecy was true, that we were living in the final days. We gave away most of our possessions. Furniture, clothes, kitchenware, things we wouldn't need in heaven. Mom packed up photo albums and family heirlooms and gave them to her sister, Aunt Linda, who lived in California and didn't believe in the prophecy. Linda had left the church years ago, had stopped coming to services when she went to college and discovered what she called the real world. My parents had barely spoken to her since, viewing her as fallen, as someone who'd turned her back on God. But now, in these final days, Mom called her, crying, begging her to reconsider, to get right with God before it was too late. I could hear Linda's voice through the phone, calm and concerned, trying to talk sense into my mother, but Mom just cried harder and told her she loved her and she'd pray for her soul. The week before September 23rd, school didn't happen. Not even homeschool. We spent entire days at church, praying, singing hymns, listening to Pastor Davies explain what would happen. He was so specific about it. He said the rapture would occur at sunset, that the evening sky would split open and Christ would descend with his holy angels. He described it in such detail that I could picture it perfectly, had dreamed about it, had imagined it so many times that it felt like a memory of something that had already happened. People from other churches started showing up, people who'd heard about Pastor Davies and his prophecy. Our little church couldn't hold everyone, so services moved outside to the field behind the building. Hundreds of people gathered there, maybe more. They came from all over Kansas, from Missouri, from Nebraska. Some had driven for days. They'd heard that God had revealed the date to Pastor Davies, that he was a true prophet, that if they wanted to be sure of their salvation, they needed to be with us when it happened. September 22nd, the night before the prophecy, we didn't go home. None of us did. We stayed at the church, the entire congregation, waiting and praying and preparing our hearts. Pastor Davies led us in a marathon prayer session that lasted all night. People took turns praying out loud, confessing sins, declaring their faith, thanking God for the gift of salvation. I sat between my parents, holding hands with both of them, and I prayed harder than I'd ever prayed in my life. I begged God to make me worthy, to take me with my family, to not let me be left behind. Tommy fell asleep around midnight, his head on my mother's lap. I envied him. I was exhausted, but I couldn't sleep, couldn't let my guard down. What if falling asleep meant I wasn't vigilant enough? What if that's what kept me from being taken? I stayed awake all night, my eyes burning, my body aching, but my heart racing with anticipation and terror. When the sun rose on September 23, 1994, there was this collective sense of awe. This was it. The last sunrise. The last day of human history as we knew it. Pastor Davies led us in singing hymns as the sun climbed higher, and people wept openly, their faces turned toward heaven. Some were trembling. Others looked peaceful, serene, ready. My father's face was radiant. I'd never seen him look so alive, so certain of anything. My mother held Tommy and me close, whispering prayers over our heads, telling us how much she loved us, how we'd all be together in paradise soon. We spent the day in worship. People barely ate, barely moved from their spots in the field. As the sun began its descent, the atmosphere became electric. This was it. Sunset was approaching. Pastor Davies stood before us, his arms raised, leading us in prayer. Around me, people were shouting praises, crying, some of them already reaching their arms toward the sky as if they could pull heaven down to meet us. I remember the exact moment when the sun touched the horizon. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I closed my eyes, waiting to feel that pull, that transformation Pastor Davies had described. Around me, I could hear people gasping, some shouting, "Yes, Jesus!" and "Come, Lord!" And I waited, and nothing happened. The sun kept setting, the way it always did. Slowly, beautifully, the sky turning orange and pink and purple. It touched the horizon and slipped below it, and we were still standing in that field in Kansas, our feet firmly on the ground, our bodies unchanged, the sky above us ordinary and indifferent to our expectations. At first, People thought maybe they'd miscalculated the time. Maybe it was later. Maybe it would happen after the sun fully set, in that moment between day and night. So we waited as darkness fell, as the first stars appeared, as the full weight of night settled over us. We stood there, hundreds of us, silent now, waiting for something that was becoming increasingly clear wasn't going to happen. I looked at my father, and I saw something break in his face. It was like watching a building collapse from the inside, the structure remaining intact while everything that held it up crumbled away. My mother started to cry, not the joyful tears of rapture but the raw, broken sobs of someone whose world had just shattered. Tommy asked in his small voice, "When is it going to happen?" And no one had an answer for him. Pastor Davies kept insisting we needed to wait, that maybe he'd made an error in his calculations, that it might be midnight, that we needed to have faith. But I could hear the doubt creeping into his voice, see the fear in his eyes. By midnight, people had started to leave. Not everyone, but enough that you could feel the certainty draining away, being replaced by confusion and then, slowly, by the terrible dawning of reality. We stayed until the next morning. Dad refused to leave, insisted that we needed to keep faith, that surely God wouldn't abandon us. But when the sun rose again on September 24th, when the world continued spinning and life went on exactly as it had before, something fundamental broke in all of us. The drive home was silent. No one said a word. Tommy had cried himself to sleep. Mom stared out the window. Dad's hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white. And I sat in the back seat, feeling like I'd been hollowed out, like everything I believed, everything I'd been so certain of, had been scooped out of me, leaving just an empty shell. The aftermath was worse than the prophecy not coming true. That might sound strange, but it's the truth. At least during the waiting, we'd had purpose, certainty, community. After, we had nothing but the wreckage of our lives and the terrible question of what now. Dad lost his job. He'd quit weeks before, and when he tried to get it back, they'd already hired someone else. The money he'd given to the church was gone. The truck was gone. Our savings were depleted. We'd sold or given away so much that our house felt empty, echoing. Mom's sister wouldn't return her calls. The college brochures Jennifer had burned couldn't be unburned. The Johnsons' farm had been sold to people who had no intention of selling it back. Mrs. Garrett, who'd stopped her cancer treatments, died that December. Her death felt like a murder we were all complicit in. The congregation fell apart. Some people left immediately, too angry or embarrassed or hurt to return. Others stayed, desperate to make sense of what had happened, to find some way to reconcile their faith with this massive failure. Pastor Davies gave a sermon the next Sunday trying to explain it. He said he must have misinterpreted the signs, that God had tested our faith, that perhaps the rapture had been delayed because we needed more time to save souls. But his voice lacked conviction, and people stared at him with eyes that held betrayal instead of devotion. Within 6 months, Pastor Davies was gone. Some said he'd been forced out. Others said he left on his own, unable to face what he'd done. I heard later that he'd moved to Arizona, that he'd left ministry entirely. I don't know if that's true. I never saw him again. My relationship with my parents changed after that. I'd always trusted them completely, believed they knew what was right, that they would protect me. But they'd led me into something that hurt me profoundly. They'd made me give up my childhood for a lie, and even though they believed it too, even though they'd been victims just as much as I was, I couldn't help but resent them. That resentment sat between us like a wall. We couldn't talk about what had happened. Any attempt to discuss it led to arguments or stony silence. Dad became bitter, angry at God, angry at Pastor Davies, angry at himself. Mom retreated into a kind of desperate, quiet faith, still going to church, a different one now, but never speaking about the prophecy, pretending it had never happened. I stopped believing in God. Not all at once, but gradually. It started with questions I couldn't answer. If God was all-knowing, why did he let Pastor Davies lead us astray? If he was all-loving, why did he allow people to ruin their lives over a false prophecy? If the Bible was his word, how could someone study it so intensely and come to such a wrong conclusion? And if Pastor Davies could be so wrong about something he was so certain about, what else might be wrong? How could I trust anything anyone said about God? I went through the motions for a while, still attending church with my family because I had no choice, but I felt nothing. The prayers felt empty. The hymns felt like lies. When people spoke about their faith with certainty, I felt anger rising in me. How dare they be so sure? How dare they act like they knew what God wanted or what would happen? I'd learned the hard way that certainty was dangerous, that faith could be weaponized, that belief could destroy lives just as easily as it could save souls. When I was old enough to leave home, I did. I went to college in Colorado, as far from Kansas as I could afford to get. I didn't tell my parents I'd lost my faith entirely. I let them think I was just going through a phase, dealing with doubt, that I'd come back to God eventually. But I knew I wouldn't. That 12-year-old girl who'd prayed desperately not to be left behind was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned that the only person you could really count on was yourself. College was hard. I'd been so sheltered, so isolated from the world, that everything felt foreign and frightening. I struggled academically at first. There were huge gaps in my education, subjects I'd never learned because we'd focused so exclusively on scripture during that last year of homeschooling. I had to take remedial classes, had to work twice as hard as my classmates to catch up. I felt behind in social skills too. I didn't know how to relate to people who hadn't grown up in church, who didn't carry the same baggage I did. But slowly, I found my footing. I made friends with people who'd never heard of the rapture, who'd never spent nights praying in terror, who thought of the future as something to plan for, not something to fear or give up on. I took psychology classes and learned about cognitive dissonance, about how people cling to beliefs even when confronted with evidence that contradicts them, about the powerful pull of community and the human need to find meaning in suffering. I started to understand what had happened to us not as a failure of faith, but as a very human susceptibility to charismatic leadership and group dynamics. I met my husband, David, my junior year. He was raised Catholic but had drifted away from the church, more cultural than devout. When I told him about the prophecy, about that year of my life, he listened without judgment. He didn't try to fix it or explain it away or tell me what I should believe. He just held my hand and said, "That must have been terrifying," and somehow that simple acknowledgement of my pain meant more than any theological argument could have. We got married after graduation. My parents came to the wedding, though things were strained. Dad had found work again, but he'd never recovered financially or emotionally from what happened. He'd returned to church, a small Baptist congregation, but his faith was different now, quieter, tinged with sadness. Mom still held on to her belief more stubbornly, still insisted that God had a plan even if we couldn't understand it. Tommy, my brother, hadn't spoken to them in years. He'd left home at 18 and never looked back, angry in a way I understood but couldn't quite mirror. He blamed them more directly than I did. Last I heard, he was living in Seattle, working in tech, as far removed from our childhood as he could get in every possible way. David and I had our daughter, Emma, when I was 30. Holding her in the hospital, looking at her tiny perfect face, I felt this surge of fierce protectiveness. I would not raise her with fear. I would not tell her the world was ending. I would not let anyone convince her to give up on her future. She would go to a good school, she would have friends, she would dream about college and careers and all the ordinary beautiful things that make up a human life. But I also realized, in that moment, that I couldn't protect her from everything. I couldn't prevent her from ever being hurt or disappointed or let down by people she trusted. All I could do was be honest with her, teach her to think critically, show her that it's okay to ask questions, that doubt isn't the enemy of truth but its ally. Emma's 16 now. She knows about the prophecy. I told her when she was old enough to understand, not because I wanted to burden her with my trauma but because I wanted her to learn from it. I wanted her to know that people can be very sincere and still very wrong, that authority figures can fail you, that you have to think for yourself. She listened with wide eyes, asked thoughtful questions, and then said something that made me cry. She said, "I'm sorry that happened to you, Mom. But I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you didn't let it ruin your whole life." But the truth is, it did change my whole life. How could it not? I lost something that year that I can never get back. Not just my childhood or my innocence, but a certain capacity for trust, for certainty, for the kind of faith that doesn't ask questions. Sometimes I envy people who can believe easily, who can find comfort in religion, who never have to wrestle with the doubts that plague me. But I also know I'm better off this way. I'm more careful, more skeptical, less likely to follow anyone blindly. I've thought a lot over the years about why it happened, why Pastor Davies believed so strongly in something that turned out to be completely false. I don't think he was evil or deliberately manipulative. I think he genuinely believed he'd discovered something, that God had revealed truth to him. And once he'd convinced himself, once he'd put his certainty out into the world, he couldn't back down without losing everything. So he doubled down, and we all went along with it because we wanted to believe, because it gave our lives meaning and purpose, because the alternative was ordinary existence without the promise of imminent divine intervention. There have been other prophecies since then. Other preachers predicting other dates, other groups of people giving up everything for the promise that the end is near. Every time I hear about one, I feel sick. I think about the children in those communities, about the 12-year-olds lying awake at night, terrified of being left behind, and I want to shake their parents, want to scream at them to stop, to think about what they're doing. But I know they wouldn't listen. We didn't listen to the people who tried to warn us. We thought they were the deceived ones, that we had the truth. I don't hate God, exactly. I don't spend my energy being angry at a being I'm not sure exists. But I'm deeply suspicious of anyone who claims to speak for God, who says they know with certainty what divine will looks like. I've seen where that certainty leads, and it's not to truth or salvation. It's to broken families and ruined lives and the kind of disillusionment that never fully heals. My relationship with my parents improved somewhat as I got older. We learned to talk about other things, to find common ground in our love for Emma, in shared memories that predated the prophecy. Dad died 5 years ago, a heart attack, sudden and shocking. At his funeral, someone who'd been part of the congregation back then came up to me and said, "Your father never stopped feeling guilty about what happened. He thought he'd failed you and Tommy." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to agree, to confirm that yes, he had failed us. But another part of me, the part that had become a parent myself, understood that he'd done what he thought was right, that he'd been trying to save our souls, that love and harm can exist in the same action. Mom's still alive, living in the same house in Kansas. We talk on the phone once a week. She still goes to church, still believes, though she's careful never to speak too certainly about anything anymore. She's learned caution the hard way. Sometimes I think about asking her directly if she still thinks the prophecy was real, if she thinks maybe we just misunderstood something, but I never do. What would be the point? She's made her peace with it somehow, and opening that wound again won't help either of us. Tommy and I reconnected a few years ago. He called me out of the blue, and we talked for hours, comparing notes on our childhoods, on how we'd each processed what happened. He's angrier than I am, more openly damaged by it. He has nightmares still, he told me, about being 12 years old and thinking the world was ending. He's in therapy now, working through it, trying to build a life that's not defined by that trauma. We try to see each other once a year. It helps, knowing someone else remembers, someone else understands without me having to explain. I think about that 12-year-old girl a lot. The one who lay awake praying desperately not to be left behind, who gave up her dreams because she was told they didn't matter, who trusted the adults around her to know what was true. I mourn for her sometimes. She deserved better. She deserved to be a kid, to worry about normal things like homework and crushes and what she'd be when she grew up. She deserved to plan for a future, to believe the world would still be here when she turned 13 and 14 and all the ages I've now far surpassed. But I'm also grateful, in a strange way. What happened made me who I am. It taught me to question, to think critically, to never take anyone's word as absolute truth no matter how convinced they seem. It made me a better parent, more conscious of the weight of the things we tell our children, more careful about imposing my beliefs on Emma. It gave me empathy for people who are trapped in similar situations, who are being told the end is near, who are sacrificing their presence for a promised future that will never come. I still remember the feeling of standing in that field, watching the sun set on September 23, 1994. The anticipation, the fear, the absolute certainty that something world-changing was about to happen. And then the terrible, creeping realization that it wasn't, that we'd been wrong, that all of it had been for nothing. That feeling never completely left me. It's like a scar, invisible to others but something I'm always aware of, a place where the skin is tougher but also more tender. Sometimes people ask me if I'll ever go back to church, if I'll ever believe again. I don't know how to answer that. I can't go back to the kind of faith I had before. That innocent, unquestioning trust is gone forever. But I'm not sure I want it back. It made me vulnerable to manipulation, made me willing to accept things that didn't make sense because an authority figure told me they were true. What I have now instead is a kind of careful openness. I don't claim to know if there's a God or an afterlife or any ultimate meaning to existence. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. What I know is that we're here now, that life is precious and finite and shouldn't be thrown away for promises that might not materialize. I know that people are fallible, even well-meaning ones, even religious ones, maybe especially religious ones who are so certain they're right that they stop questioning themselves. I teach Emma to be kind, to think critically, to stand up for herself, to build a life she's proud of. I teach her that it's okay not to have all the answers, that uncertainty is a more honest position than false certainty. I teach her to value the present, to plan for the future, to not let anyone convince her that her dreams don't matter. Maybe that's my own form of faith. Faith in the human capacity to build meaning and purpose without needing a divine plan. Faith that life is worth living even if it's all we get. It's been 31 years since that September evening when the sky didn't fall. I've lived more than twice as long since the prophecy as I'd lived before it. I have a career I love, teaching high school English, helping teenagers find their voices and think critically about the world. I have a husband who knows all my broken parts and loves me anyway. I have a daughter who is everything I hoped for, smart and curious and unafraid to question things. I have a life I never would have had if the prophecy had been true. And yet, I still carry that 12-year-old girl with me. The one who believed, who prayed, who was so afraid and so hopeful all at once. She's part of me, will always be part of me. Her experience shaped every decision I've made since, every value I hold, every caution I exercise. She reminds me to be skeptical but not cynical, to be careful but not closed off, to remember that people can survive having their whole worldview shattered and build something new from the pieces. On September 23rd every year, I take a moment to remember. I think about everyone who was in that field with me, about where they are now, how they made sense of what happened. I think about the Johnsons and their lost farm, about Mrs. Garrett who died believing she'd get a new body in heaven any day now, about Jennifer's burned college brochures and all the futures that were sacrificed for a prophecy that never came true. I think about Pastor Davies wherever he is, and wonder if he ever truly faced what he'd done or if he found a way to excuse it, to convince himself that he'd been sincere even if he'd been wrong. And I think about all the other children out there right now, being told the world is ending, being asked to give up their dreams and their futures for someone else's certainty. I wish I could save them all, could tell them to hold on to their hopes, to question what they're being told, to know that they deserve to plan for tomorrow. But I can't reach them. All I can do is tell my story, be honest about what happened and how it affected me, and hope that maybe someone reads it and thinks twice before following the next prophet who claims to know when the world will end. Because here's what I've learned in my 47 years, in the 31 years since the prophecy failed. The world ends and begins again every single day in small ways. Relationships end, jobs end, chapters of life close. But the sun keeps rising, and there's always a chance to start again, to rebuild, to find new meaning. The apocalypse we were promised never came, but I've lived through my own personal apocalypses, moments when everything I thought I knew turned out to be wrong, and I survived them. We all did, those of us who were in that field. We survived and we built new lives, and that survival, that rebuilding, that's its own kind of faith. I don't have the certainty I had when I was 12. I don't know what happens when we die, or if there's a God listening to our prayers, or if any of this means anything beyond what we make it mean. But I know I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful for every ordinary day, every mundane moment, every sunrise that keeps coming despite all the prophecies that said it wouldn't. I'm grateful for the future I was told I wouldn't have, for every year past 12, for becoming 13 and 20 and 30 and now 47. The world didn't end on September 23, 1994. It just kept going, indifferent and beautiful and terrible and ordinary. And somehow, against everything I believed when I was 12, that turned out to be enough. More than enough. It turned out to be everything.